The silence didn't just break, it shattered. Because this wasn't a calm prince seeking justice, this was a man detonating decades of buried fury in the middle of a courtroom, accusing powerful women in the British press of crawling inside his head and wrecking it from the inside out. This was never about newspapers. This was about a mind, Harry says, was systematically poisoned. From the moment Prince Harry stepped into court, the energy was off, heavy, charged. This wasn't strategy, it was revenge wrapped in legal language. He didn't come to debate, he came to expose. And what he unleashed wasn't a lawsuit, it was a confession soaked in rage, paranoia, and unfinished trauma. Because in Harry's version of events, this wasn't press scrutiny, it was psychological warfare carried out by women with bylines, access, and influence. And he was finally saying it out loud. It's all exploded once again at the High Court as Prince Harry's action against the Daily Mail becomes ever more explosive. He doesn't just want to bring down the Daily Mail. He wants to bring down the most famous females on Fleet Street who he believes have been ruining his life for the past 3 decades. Ruining his life. 3 decades. Let that sit. Harry wasn't talking about bad press days or embarrassing headlines. He was talking about a slow mental erosion, a drip feed of exposure, suspicion, and fear that he claims never stopped. And suddenly, the target wasn't abstract media culture anymore. It had names, faces, careers. Then came the moment that felt less like legal procedure and more like a public naming ritual. Those women in question. Victoria Newton, Rebecca English, and Katie Nichols, a thorn in the side of Prince Harry for years because she's revealed many true stories about him. 3 women, 3 journalists, and in Harry's narrative, 3 villains. Victoria Newton, Rebecca English, Katie Nichols. To Harry, these weren't reporters doing a job. They were watchers, trackers, people who allegedly knew things they shouldn't know, movements, locations, relationships, details he believes could only have come from unlawful intrusion. And this is where the story stops being about privacy and starts being about fear. Because Harry isn't just claiming embarrassment. He's claiming danger. He's claiming that information about his life was so precise it could have put him and the women he loved at serious risk. And that belief has been living in his head for years. Outside the courtroom, reporters tried to pull him back into the public conversation. He didn't bite. Let me show you Harry deciding to ignore questions about whether he just hates free speech on the way into court this morning. How important is free speech alongside press accountability? Nothing. No response. No acknowledgement. Because to Harry, free speech isn't a principle. It's a weapon that was used on him over and over again. And he wasn't interested in debating theory. He was there to settle emotional scores. Inside the courtroom, his legal team stitched together years of articles into one continuous nightmare. Early 2000s gossip blended into later travel reports. Relationships mapped out before he announced them. Trips described before he'd even landed. Harry says it all felt like being hunted, like someone always knew where he'd be next. And then came the line that changed everything. Then Harry's witness statement admitted that all of this has caused distress, paranoia, and other feelings it generates. Paranoia, not whispered by critics, not speculated by commentators, admitted on record by Harry himself. That single word sucked the oxygen out of the room, because once paranoia enters the courtroom, the story fractures. Suddenly, every claim exists in 2 realities, the one Harry feels and the one the court has to verify. Harry says his paranoia didn't come from nowhere. He says it was manufactured, fed by constant exposure, invasive reporting, and details so specific they felt impossible to obtain legally. One accusation hit harder than the rest, because it wasn't about gossip, it was about safety. Sherborne accused her of obtaining the exact plane seats, flight times, and travel plans. Harry says it's deeply disturbing seeing this information. It demonstrates irresistibly that Rebecca English used unlawful information gathering, exact seat numbers, flight times, travel plans. To Harry, that wasn't journalism, that was surveillance. And once he says that out loud, you start to understand why his mind spiraled. Because if someone always knows where you are, how do you ever feel safe? But just as the story seemed airtight, the contradiction slipped in quietly and detonated. It's also been revealed that Harry did have a personal relationship with Katie Nichols, and that he did invite her to come and party with Harry and her friends. Party, invite, personal relationship. Suddenly, the monster had a handshake, because if these journalists were the architects of his mental destruction, why were some of them close enough to be welcomed into his private world? That revelation didn't just confuse observers, it destabilized the narrative, and critics wasted no time. If he trusted them enough to socialize, when did trust turn into to terror? Who crossed the line first? And were those lines ever clear? That's when the spotlight shifted, not just onto the press, but onto Harry himself. Harry admits that he does have a huge amount of paranoia. He sees criminality everywhere. He thinks everything is a stitch-up. He thinks everyone is out to get him. That wasn't just commentary, that was a reframing. Because now, the image isn't a prince versus the press, it's a man who believes he's been under siege for most of his adult life, scanning every headline for threat, every reporter for betrayal. And once that belief sets in, everything becomes evidence. By the end of the day, the courtroom wasn't debating articles anymore. It was dissecting a psyche shaped by fame, trauma, and years of unresolved resentment. Harry didn't just accuse journalists of destroying his mind, he showed how deeply those wounds still bleed. And as the case moved forward, one terrifying question hovered over everything. Is this trial about exposing illegal journalism, or about a man still fighting a war inside his own head? The atmosphere shifted the moment the courtroom realized this wasn't just a legal fight anymore, it was a psychological unmasking happening in real time, with every sentence tightening the spotlight on Harry instead of the press. Because once paranoia is admitted, the courtroom stops being a battlefield and starts feeling like a mirror, and Harry kept looking into it. What stunned observers wasn't just what he accused the journalists of doing, it was how deeply he'd internalized it. He didn't speak like someone recalling isolated incidents, he spoke like someone who had been cataloging pain for years. Dates, articles, bylines, patterns. Connections stretching back decades, all fused together into one continuous narrative of persecution. And the more he explained it, the clearer it became this wasn't a chapter of his life. This was the lens through which he now sees everything. Legal analysts began whispering the same concern, not loudly, not cruelly, but consistently. Harry's case relied heavily on how things felt, not always on how they were proven. And while emotional harm is real, the law demands something colder, harder, documented. That gap started to widen. Because for every allegation of unlawful information gathering, the defense quietly countered with an uncomfortable truth. Many of the stories Harry resents were accurate. Some came from palace insiders, others were later confirmed. And that shifted the accusation from "they lied about me" to something far more complicated: "they knew before I wanted them to." And that distinction is brutal. Because truth can still feel violent when you're not ready for it. Exposure can still traumatize even when it's legal. But in court, legality matters more than pain, and Harry's argument kept sliding between the two. Observers also couldn't ignore the contradiction hovering over everything: Harry's relationship with publicity itself, the interviews, the documentaries, the memoir, the globally televised confessions. Critics latched onto it immediately. How does someone condemn exposure while actively producing it? How does privacy become sacred only when someone else controls the narrative? Harry's supporters pushed back hard. They argued this wasn't hypocrisy, it was reclamation. That telling his story on his own terms wasn't exploitation, it was survival. That silence nearly destroyed him and speaking was the only way out. And maybe that's true. But the courtroom doesn't run on intention, it runs on consistency. And consistency is where things kept unraveling. Because Harry didn't just say the press watched him, he revealed that he watched them too. He followed their careers, remembered their names, tracked their coverage across years, folded each uncomfortable article into a growing internal archive of resentment. That admission didn't make him look calculating. It made him look consumed. Consumed by a past that never loosened its grip. Consumed by a sense of being hunted even when the threat may have changed shape or stopped entirely. And that's when the narrative fully flipped. The press stopped looking like the only subject on trial. Harry's perception of reality was now under examination too. Commentators began asking the question no one wanted to say out loud: did the press break Harry, or did Harry's unresolved trauma turn the press into a permanent enemy in his mind? Because trauma doesn't fade quietly. It rewrites memory. It sharpens suspicion. It teaches the brain to stay alert long after the danger has passed. And Harry has lived his entire life under a microscope that most people would collapse under. But the law doesn't treat trauma as proof. That became painfully clear as proceedings dragged on. The defense didn't need dramatic takedowns. They let Harry talk. They let the contradictions breathe. They let the admissions pile up. And slowly, the case stopped feeling like a clean-cut exposure of media misconduct and started feeling like a man reliving old wounds in public, hoping the court would validate his pain. The gender dynamic made everything even more volatile. Because Harry wasn't just accusing journalists, worse, he was singling out powerful women by name, women who climbed a brutal industry and survived it, women with reputations, influence, and careers built on access. To supporters, this was accountability. To critics, it looked like fixation, and perception matters. Some observers argue that these women had unusual proximity to royal information, making scrutiny fair. Others questioned why male journalists weren't central to the narrative if the issue was systemic rather than personal. Harry never directly addressed that imbalance, but the silence spoke volumes. By this point, the courtroom energy had shifted from outrage to unease. Sympathy didn't vanish, but it complicated, because it's possible to believe Harry suffered and believe his case is unraveling. It's possible to acknowledge emotional harm while questioning legal merit. And that tension defined everything that followed. The most devastating possibility now hanging over the trial isn't that Harry loses outright, it's that he wins nothing while exposing everything. His fears, his obsessions, his inability to let go of a war that may have already ended in reality, but not in his head. If the judge rules against him, critics will say this was never about justice, it was about validation. If he wins, others will argue the precedent is built on emotional testimony rather than hard evidence. Either way, the damage is already permanent, because Harry didn't just put journalists on trial, he put his own inner world under a microscope. And once that door opened, there was no closing it. Every contradiction, every blurred friendship, every admission of paranoia, they're all part of the record now. This wasn't a prince calmly seeking accountability. This was a man still fighting ghosts, still replaying betrayals, still demanding recognition for pain that never healed. The court may deliver a verdict, but it won't deliver peace, because no ruling can undo decades of mistrust, resentment, and psychological fallout, especially when that battle has become part of identity itself. Harry walked into that courtroom believing he would finally expose the press. What he exposed instead was the cost of never escaping them. And once that truth is out, there's no appeal strong enough to erase it. Appeal strong enough to erase it. Appeal strong enough to erase it. Appeal strong.